Have you ever wondered how a rich industrialized country can go broke? Well, no worries. If you live in the USA, UK, France, or a southern European country, you are probably only a few years away from finding out firsthand. These people in the video, for example, are French citizens, and they are protesting a new bill which was presented to Parliament last week. And it's not really hard to understand why they are pissed off. The government wants to save on social spending, fire 3,000 people who work for the government, and cut 2 public holidays. Especially this last point is getting people to be really riled up. But the reason why this is necessary is pretty simple. France has too much debt, and so do a lot of Western countries. But how did we get here? How can such a large and wealthy country like France be basically bankrupt? The country has about 3 trillion euros in debt. That is a number with 12 digits. And it is so massive that France will never be able to pay it off. Not in our lifetime, and probably never. And yet, France is not alone in this situation. Most industrialized nations aren't doing much better. But to better understand the problem, we need to put some of these numbers into context. When France has 3 trillion euros of debt, it's obviously something different than if the Philippines or Peru had the same amount of debt. France's economy is much larger, so the country can afford to take on more debt. That's why national debt is usually expressed as a percentage of GDP, gross domestic product, so the country's total economic output. In France's case, the GDP is about 3.052 trillion euros. The national debt is just about 3.3 trillion euros, which equals roughly 111% of GDP. Still, this percentage probably doesn't mean a lot to you right now, so let's break it down. If a country has less than 60% debt to GDP ratio, everything is fine, essentially. But hardly any country meets this threshold. Pretty much the only countries which are still below 60% are a few Eastern European countries. And the reason they have so little debt is because most of these countries have only been in existence for about 35 years, and back in the 90s and early 2000s they were having so many problems that nobody was really willing to lend them money. But generally speaking, up to 60% of debt to GDP is considered very safe and easy to manage. For example, if you want to join the European Union, you have to meet a number of economic criteria, and one of the requirements is having a debt to GDP ratio below 60%. Although once you have joined the Union, you are free to take on more debt, so pretty much no country inside the EU is still meeting this threshold. Between 60 and 90%, things are still looking pretty okay. Germany, for instance, is one of the few industrial nations with such a low amount of debt. This is mostly thanks to an add-on to the constitution from back in 2011, where Germany kept its debt at 60%, and the country is still hovering around this level right now, although the new government, which came into power only like half a year ago, has stated that they are going to break this and they will take on more debt. They have already gotten the go-ahead and repealed the law, but they are still not quite clear on how much debt to take on and for what exactly. But once you hit those 90%, it starts getting problematic. This is why most economists roughly draw a line around these 90%. And the reason why it is so rough is, well, first of all, that the debt is suddenly so massive, it is nearly impossible to pay it off within a single human lifetime. And worse, you have to pay interest on your debt. If you borrow $300,000 from a bank to buy a house, The bank will obviously want more than just those 300,000 euros back. They want interest. And it works the same way for governments. When they borrow money, they have to pay interest. And once you are over 90%, those interest payments become a serious issue. Let's look at the USA, for example. That is a massive amount of money just to cover interest, not even to reduce the debt itself or invest in anything productive. And, well, where does that money come from? It has to be cut from some other expenditure. So pensions, education, healthcare, infrastructure, something's got to give. Usually all of them a little. Once you hit 120% debt to GDP, things get really dark. Many economists see this as a point of no return. Although some argue the collapse happens a bit later and but only at 107% your country just goes into the garbage bin, 120% your governments are still forced to make cuts so drastic they damage the economy itself. And also, if something like a pandemic or a natural disaster happens, there is no money left to react to this. But reacting would be essential. Whenever there is a war, a flood, an economic crash, governments usually respond by spending more. But if your country can no longer do this, the crisis gets much worse, not better, and it will get more expensive. People suffer, the economy struggles, and the situation spirals downward. And this is how countries fall into a kind of slow death. It's like circling the drain. And it is what France and the UK are going through right now, if you will. The economy weakens because there's no investments. Schools and hospitals are understaffed and falling apart because there is no money, because all the money has to be spent on servicing your debt. So interest and stagnation worsen the debt situation. And eventually the government faces two choices. And the first one is to raise taxes dramatically, which will make people poorer and is deeply unpopular. And usually if you try to raise taxes in a stagnant or declining economic climate, that is a catastrophe. It makes some money in the short term, but in the mid to long term, your economy takes such a bad hit that your government revenue actually decreases instead of increasing. And this is often a downward spiral which a country cannot come back from. So this leaves us with option number 2, which is to basically blow your country up. Declare national bankruptcy. Do you remember the Greek debt crisis in 2012? This is exactly what happened to Greece. Greece had so much debt it couldn't even pay the interest rates anymore or fulfill its government functions. There was a huge debate about whether the EU and some of the richer European countries should give them money to bail them out. Greece did receive financial aid, but the default had devastating consequences. The economy collapsed, thousands of public servants were fired, wages and pensions were slashed, unemployment skyrocketed, hundreds of thousands, mostly young, educated people left the country, which long-term made the situation even worse. Depression and suicide rates spiked. The government couldn't maintain schools, hospitals, basic infrastructure. At one point, 60% of young people were unemployed. And to this day, Greece has not fully recovered. One key issue is that government debt isn't like personal debt. If a private person takes out a loan, the interest rate is, in most cases, fixed. But a country's interest rates can change rapidly. This is because government issues so-called government bonds and investors buy them up. And through a system of supply and demand, the price of these bonds and the interest rates go up and down. So this can be positive in the terms of, well, you buying up a lot of government debt and the interest rate being lower. but it mostly has the very bad consequence of suddenly blowing up and skyrocketing, especially if something disastrous happens or if you have to raise your interest rates. So if your central bank raises your interest rates, you'll also have to pay more to service your debt, and you have to pay more interest rate on your debt. And this dynamic can pretty much bankrupt your country from one day to another if you have a lot of debt, because 1% more of interest on a large amount of debt can be billions of euros or dollars more, which you have to find in your household every year. You have to balance your budget in a way where you can pay off this money. But if your budget is stretched so thin, then this can pretty much blow you out of the water. For example, have you seen this woman before? That's Liz Truss, who was briefly the Prime Minister of the UK. She is mostly known because there was a live stream of a head of lettuce to see if the lettuce would start to rot before she resigned. The lettuce won. Liz Truss was Prime Minister for 49 days, the shortest term in British history. And the reason why she was forced out? Debt. She announced massive tax cuts, mostly for the wealthy and large corporations, even though the UK was already heavily in debt. And this caused a panic among investors. They feared the UK might go bankrupt and dumped the government bonds. As a result, interest rates shot up by 1.5% to 4.42% in a very short time. So now the country had to pay 4.42% interest, which was about 10 to 20 billion pounds extra per year, enough to wreck the entire national budget. Confidence in Liz Truss collapsed. The lettuce meme was born. She told Parliament shortly after that she was a fighter, not a quitter, that she would stay. And the next day she quit, both as Prime Minister and as leader of the Tories. Thank you for watching. That's all for today. I do want to do a second video on why governments keep borrowing anyways, but I don't know when I will be able to get to it. I got a lot to do right now. And I do want to do some other videos first, so it's probably not gonna be anytime soon, but I promise I will do that second part at some point. So in the meantime, leave a like, leave a sub, and thank you for watching.